The base doll is a puck made by Logan Dolls. If you don't know of Logan Dolls, you need to fix your life right away, because this is seriously one of the most beautiful male sculpts I've ever seen. And I've been collecting BJDs for years. Also, Logan's birthday was March 7th, so you might want to go wish him a happy birthday. But seriously, this doll stands better than any other doll I've owned.
Wow.
Face. Oh.
The sculpting is next level, and all of these joints and features make him a dream to pose. Every project must start somewhere, and I started with his arming doublet. In the Tears of the Kingdom, Link's arming doublet seems to be a green rib-knit, long-sleeve turtleneck. So, I began by drafting a basic bodice pattern with long sleeves and used that as my shirt pattern. The doll-making gods smiled upon me because I found this perfectly scaled green rib-knit fabric. I mean, no one is ever that lucky, right? Next, I traced and cut my fabric pieces. As you can see here, I flipped my front and back pieces over to make one solid front piece and one solid back piece. At my sewing machine, I attached the front and back together at the shoulder seam. Then I folded over my cuff pieces and sewed it to the wrist end of the sleeves. Then I stitched in the ditch of my seam to tack down my seam allowance. The caps of sleeves still make me super nervous to machine sew together, so I pin the pieces and hand sew them with a back stitch. Next, I fold the shirt right sides together and sew them from the sleeve cuff to the waist. Then I fold the collar in half and stitch the short sides together to make a loop. After that, I sew the collar to the neck opening, right sides together. Then I do the same thing for the waistband. Finally, I've completed Link's first item of clothing, a green, rib-knit, turtleneck arming doublet. It's not really clear what type of fabric Link's trousers are made from. All we know is that they need to be pretty heavy-duty and that they are kind of khaki colored. That's about it. I hunted and hunted and hunted, and I finally chose this light yellow denim-like fabric. It's still pretty thin, but looks like fabric you could climb mountains with. So I designed a trouser pattern based on the doll's measurement and cut out the fabric. At my sewing machine, I folded the back pant along the dart and sewed, and did the same to the front pieces. Then I laid my two front pieces together, right sides facing in, and sewed up the crotch seam. Then I lined up my back pieces with the front and sewed up the outer leg seam, and top stitched on either side of the seams to create a more industrial, heavy-duty look for the pants. Next, I snipped the back crotch seam down about halfway and folded it over to make a finished opening in the back of my pant. Then I folded over and stitched in place the ankle openings. With the waistband fabric, I folded the long edges to the center line and then folded it again in half to make a bias tape. Then I opened the waistband and aligned one long end against the raw edge of the waist and sewed along the first fold line. Next, I folded the bias tape over the raw edge and stitched it in place. Then I stitched up the remainder of the back crotch seam, then sewed the pant from one ankle through the crotch and to the other ankle, then folded over and stitched the excess waistband fabric. Unfortunately, the trousers came out too baggy in the waist, leg, and crotch, so I traced my pattern and modified the pieces to fit better. Then did a mock-up with linen fabric before doing all of those sewing steps again. It wouldn't be Link without gorgeous long blonde hair, right? So I began by removing his head and discovered this arrow debossed in the resin inside the backplate. You see, this is Logan's tribute to his sister who passed away. Knowing that makes this doll even more special to me. I'm telling you, Logan's creations are made with love. This is proof of that. Okay, back to making his hair. I started by covering his head with saran wrap. Then I added a layer of stretchy netting. Next, I added 3 heavy coats of Mod Podge, allowing the layers to dry for several hours between coats. The next step was to remove the wig cap from the head and cut away the excess fabric. Then I looked up online how to determine a man's hairline and marked that up on the cap. Then cut away the excess. Now, because his hair is blonde, this black cap wasn't going to do. No. So I painted it a honey blonde color. I wrapped the matching colored yarn around a piece of wood and cut one side of the ends to make long strands of yarn. Then tied the strands to a pencil. I then tediously unwound each strand until I had a pile of delicious dried ramen noodles. Then I brushed out the noodles with a slicker brush and straightened the strands with a flat iron. I marked my part line and began to glue on the wefts. When I got to my part line, I reinforced my drawing and cut it open with an X-Acto knife. Then attached some wefts to the inside of the scalp and then glued the hole shut with the help of some additional netting material and Mod Podge. Lastly, I filled in some spaces near the part line and was left with this glorious mane of hair. Unfortunately, Link's hair is shorter and more layered than this, so I needed to trim the ends and add some layers. Now, I have no clue what I'm doing, so if there are any hairstylists out there that want to give me some tips, please do. Now, I didn't realize this when I was playing through the game, but Link is wearing a full chainmail tunic. Thankfully, my wife is a chainmail master. So, we acquired these small rings, and she set off by closing the ring on half of them. Then she began to weave it in what's called a 4-in-1 pattern. This is essentially what it sounds like. She takes one open ring and loops on 4 closed rings, then closes that 5th ring to lock them all in place. Then she attaches that group of 5 with another group of 5, then that group of 10 to another group of 10 until she's essentially made fabric. Once she was done, we fastened the back with some leather twine. Layered on top of the chainmail is his Hylian Tunic. So, using the pattern I created for his arming doublet, I adjusted it slightly to work as his tunic pattern. For the lining of the tunic, I used a thin linen so it wouldn't add too much bulk. For the outside, I used a blue flannel adorned with white vinyl to create the Hylian symbols. I pressed the fabric for 15 seconds at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Then let it cool and peeled off the plastic. Then, using the guidelines I included in the vinyl, I cut out the pieces. At my machine, I placed the lining fabric to the outer fabric and then sewed along the neckline. I did the same with the back piece. Then I sewed along the bottom opening of both pieces and turned them right side out. Next, I aligned the front and the back together, right sides facing in, and sewed along the shoulder seams. With the sleeves, I folded over the cuff and stitched it in place. Then lined up the sleeve cap with the arm side and hand sewed it in place with a back stitch. Finally, I sewed up the side seams from the sleeve to the hip and top stitched on both sides of the seam. Then I have a Hylian Tunic fit for a great warrior.
We shall start this epic battle with the mighty spray box against our foe, Mr. Superclear Matte. While we shall be victorious, unfortunately, we will lose some of our brethren.
Ugh. Oh, I'm sorry. These spring allergies are really doing a number on my voice. I start his face up by adding some subdermal colors. First, yellow to his forehead and nose, then pink to his cheeks, and finally blue to his chin and in some extra areas to create shadows. Then I begin to add in some extra pink pigment to his nose, cheeks, and lips, before saving my work with another coat of Mr. Super Clear Matte. After that is dried, I use chalk pastels to block out his eyebrows, and then refine the shape with an eraser. Then I add some additional color and shading to his ears before adding another coat of MSC. With my watercolor pencils, I add in darker and darker strands of color to make his eyebrows. Then I block in some eyelashes and liner before going in and cleaning up the lines with some gouache paint. Finally, I seal all of that in place with a final layer of MSC before adding some gloss varnish to his waterline and lips. It was about this point in the project that I realized that Link has a lot of clothing pieces and accessories. Here I thought this guy was going to be done in a month, but I actually started this project in June 2023. I mean, I finally finished him though, so that means something, right? Right? So as I was talking, May 3D printed a buck for us to heat and shape some pleather over. Then she printed a shell for me to insert and wrap the pleather around. When the was fully cured, I trimmed and sanded down some of the excess inside. Then cut and glued a lining piece of pleather. Then we cut the decorative elements from a lighter shade of pleather and glued them to the pauldron. We then created a second tier and glued it to the top pauldron. In order to attach it to his arm, we used a small buckle and a strip of pleather to make an adjustable belt to wrap around his bicep. The chest harness helps secure the pauldron in place. Plus, it makes him look really, really cool. Using my basic bodice block, I developed the harness pattern and cut it out of pleather. Then cut the raised decorations out of the lighter pleather and glued them on. For the metal loop that helps attach one side of the harness to the other, we cut out the center bar from another buckle. Then I struggled to loop the fabric into it. Then I attached a buckle and strap to the sides to make a cinch under his arm. Then I made holes with an awl in order to reinforce those pieces with thread. There is actually another strap and buckle in the front, where the buckle attaches to the harness on the side and the other end loops through the cut buckle from earlier. Then I punched holes and added eyelets near the shoulders to replicate the eyelets in his armor. With that, his leather chest armor is complete. It feels odd to call this piece of armor a leather belt, considering he has like 10 other belts on him, but I don't have a better term. So I took some measurements and designed a pattern in Adobe Illustrator so I could use my xTool to cut out the pieces. Then I glued on the fiddly bits. With a needle and thread, I sewed the side pieces to the back piece. Then punched holes and added eyelets to the front of the side pieces so I could use some cording to lace it up like a corset. Now the best term I could come up with for this thing is his apron. So I did all the same steps for this piece. It kinda looks like it's floating or is held in place by his waist belts, but I decided on Velcro. Now for some more, belts. Like, seriously, how many belts does a guy need? For these, we used slightly bigger buckles, then cut and plated one of them gold. For the other, we stole a prawn from another buckle to make this one double prawned. Then we attached our cut leather for belts and even made loops for the tails of the belt to feed through. The next piece is this tiny, imperceptibly small pouch that Link somehow carries food, weapons, and even armor. That is some TARDIS technology right there. I began by designing a pattern for the bag. Then I chose this pretty faux leather that has a suede-like lining on the inside, and cut out my pieces. With the body of the pouch, I folded it in half with the fuzzy side inside and stitched up the short sides. After snipping the seam allowance on the bottom, I inserted the oval base piece and sewed the circumference. Then I sewed the loop piece in half and attached it to the back of the bag to make a loop. For the flap, I added some lining fabric and sewed around the outer edge. Then turned it right side out and top stitched to help it lay flat. I added some eyelets to the front and folded the top raw edge over to enclose my cording. Next, I attached my flap to the back and added an eyelet so the cording could pull through and keep the bag closed. Then I trimmed my tails and melted the tips so the cording wouldn't unravel. Lastly, I fed his belt through the back loops and placed it on him. I'm really looking forward to watching him place a long sword in here. I guess we need to give this guy his baby blue eyes. My wife printed me some eye bases that I proceeded to smooth by sanding. I picked out a vibrant blue metallic paint and coated the irises with it. Then I tried something a little different this time. I used my X-Acto knife to score lines in the iris. Then I dusted some additional mica powder inside. With black 3.0, I painted the pupil. Then we added some resin to the inside of the eye and placed them in our vacuum chamber to help release the bubbles. Then we cured them with our UV light. Lastly, we added a drop of resin to the top to help dome the lenses. I borrowed Link's hands and feet and gave them a thorough wash in warm water and dish soap. Once they were dry, I sprayed them with 2 coats of MSC matte. Then, using the same techniques I discuss in my subdermal color zones video, I begin to add yellow, pink, and blue to the hands and feet. At the tips of the toes and fingers, I add some additional red. And in places that have shadows or veins, I paint some purple. With my watercolor pencils, I add some additional details to the nails and some lines to the fingers. Then I seal it in with a coat of MSC matte. Finally, I add some gloss varnish to the nails, and now I have some pretty hands and feet. Normally, one would start with the undergarments first, but that's too convenient for me. No, I do it most of the way through a project. Yep, that's me. So now that we agree that I'm an idiot, let's move forward. Essentially, I wrapped his leg in fabric and hand sewed it as close to the foot as I could, then cut it out. Then I placed the fabric on a piece of paper and used a pin to mark the line. Next, I traced that line with a pencil. Using my light board, I mirrored the design so I had a full pattern piece. Then I squared off the top and connected the sides in order to create a right angle. Next, I cut out my pattern pieces. Then I cut out my fabric. At my sewing machine, I lined a cuff piece along the top of my sock and sewed. Then I did the same kind of bias tape fold that I did with the sleeve cuffs, and then I stitched in the ditch, making sure to catch the back fabric with my needle. With my cuff in place, I folded the sock in half lengthwise and sewed from cuff to toe. Using his trouser pattern as a base, I created his boxers pattern. At my sewing station, I lined the 2 front pieces together and sewed along the outer leg line. Then folded over and hemmed the bottom cuffs. Next, I laid my front and back pieces together and sewed up the crotch in the front and the back. Then I lined up my bottom crotch seam and stitched across. Next, I folded the waistband in half and sewed the short sides together, but I left a gap in the stitching. Then folded the waistband in half lengthwise and sewed it to the waist of the boxers. Then used a bobby pin to thread the elastic through the hole in the waistband and then sewed the elastic loop closed. How hard could this be, right? I mean, these boots are pretty simplistic. I began this journey by wrapping the foot and leg in saran wrap. Then I added a layer of painter's tape on top of that. Once it was fully covered, I drew the line for the top of the boot and all of my seam lines. Then cut out my pattern pieces. Next, I scanned and digitized the pattern in order to cut them out of faux leather using my xTool. Then using a heavy-duty thread and thread wax, I begin to sew the pieces together. First, the front and sides. Then the vamp and toe cap. Then the back seam. Then the counter and shank. Then I sew on the folded cuff. Next, I cut out some lining pieces from this off-white taffeta. At my sewing machine, I faced the lining pieces right sides together and sew the back seam. Then I fold over and hem the top edge. Then I sew the front seam. Back at my work table, I stuffed the lining into the boot. Then I stitched the lining in place using some holes in the pleather that will be hidden later. Okay, May came up with this amazing idea for a 2-part shoe last. This will make it easier to remove when I'm done. While she was at it, she printed some shoe soles. Then I stuffed the last into the boot as far as I could, making sure to pull the lining out as well. Next, I inserted the sole and glued the lining fabric to the underside of it. Then I stretched the faux leather tightly over the edge and glued it to the bottom of the sole as well. After that dried, I trimmed the bulky folds and sanded the bottom to make it as thin as possible. Then I painted the outsoles. I applied contact cement to the bottom of the boot and the inside of the outsole. Then glued a band along the top. Now the only thing left to do is to pull out the shoe last. Link also sports these brown fingerless gloves and leather bracers. For the gloves, I start with the tried and true cosplay staple, saran wrap and tape. Then I trace these sticky green pattern pieces and square off the corners. For the indigenous looking design on the cuffs, I used heat adhesive vinyl. Then I cut out my pieces. At my sewing station, I sewed the outer edge of the glove first. I don't want to leave the finger hole edges raw, but I also don't want to add bulk, so I lined those areas with thin netting material. And top stitched it along the edge to help it lay down better. Next, I folded the cuff in half lengthwise and sewed it to the top of the glove. Then folded the glove in half and sewed down the inner edge, and the piece between the thumb and index finger. Now that I have a glove, it's back to the saran wrap. Once I have my pattern, it's time to cook up some bracers. I kind of feel like this is Link's way of living out his hidden Batman fantasies. Either way, his hooded cape looks badass. I really struggled to find fabric that matched this dark blue color, so I took this stretchy material and dyed our own. And it turned out perfectly. Again, using the basic bodice pattern, I designed the cape pattern. But I really had to wing it when it came to the hood. Next, we digitized the pattern and used heat adhesive vinyl to print the designs. Then I cut the fabric out along the outer line. I also cut out some lining pieces. I began by sewing the two hood lining pieces together. Then I attached the cape lining to the hood lining at the neck. Then did the same for the outer pieces. Next, I lined the inner and outer cape together and sewed along the perimeter, but making sure to leave a gap to turn it right side out. Then top stitched to help it lay down better. Finally, I had this gold closure in my stash, so I sewed it to the neck to finish the cape. It just isn't Link unless he's carrying his pretty Hylian Shield. So let's make one for him. May used her 3D printing magic to create the base shield and the decorative pieces. Unfortunately, there was some sort of printing issue, so I filled the gap with epoxy sculpt. When it was cured, it was almost like nothing happened. Then I sprayed it with Mr. Surfacer 500, 1000, and 1200 grit to smooth out the surface. Next, I airbrushed on some copper conductive paint. Then electroplated it first with copper and then nickel. And did the same with all the decorative pieces. Next, I used Mr. Masking Sol to mask out the edges so I could airbrush the front with blue enamel. Then May pulled off the masking. Then we filled in the Hylian crest with red enamel paint. Then we glued in our decorative pieces. For the back of the shield, we cut out some walnut wood using our xTool machine. Then coated those suckers in some shellac. Then glued the buckles and handle to the wood, and glued the wood to the back of the shield. Then created a strap to help secure the shield to his forearm. The Master Sword is the be-all, end-all weapon in every iteration of the game. I don't think there's anything more iconic than the Master Sword. May designed and printed the pieces. Then I sprayed them with Mr. Surfacer and the copper conductive paint. Then we gave them an electrifying bath with some copper ions. Once the pieces were metallic, we sanded and buffed them until they had a mirror finish. Then we plated them with nickel. Next, I sprayed blue enamel on the pieces that needed to be blue. May then wrapped the handle with a green faux leather. Then she attached the pommel. Next, she attached the guards. Then she inserted the blade. Now he needs a scabbard to hold his Master Sword. May printed these two halves and sanded the rough edges. We found this beautiful royal blue velour in my stash and decided it was the perfect material to line the scabbard. So May glued it with big globs of contact cement. Then she trimmed the fabric and glued the two halves together and trimmed the excess fabric on top. Next, she made a painter's tape pattern to cut this beautiful blue faux leather. Then she proceeded to wrap the faux leather around the scabbard. Then we printed and electroplated these decorative pieces with 18-karat gold. Then attached them to the scabbard. Next, Link wears this harness to carry his scabbard on his back. So we build one using more straps, buckles, and rivets. Finally, we fasten it all together. We also made a strap so the shield could be carried on his back as well. One of the major zones in Tears of the Kingdom are these floating islands in the sky. And with a doll this epic, I knew I needed an awesome place to display him. So May designed and resin printed the base. Then, to prevent it from being top-heavy, we filled the bottom with concrete. Next, she mixed together a 2-part epoxy in order to attach the bottom of the base to the top. Then, I painted it black. Then, using a sponge and some gray acrylic paint, I stippled on some texture. Then I added some green. Then dry brushed on some white. This really helps pick up the texture and add some highlights. Then we stippled on some Mod Podge in select places and applied some grass flocking using a static flocking applicator. Electricity is fun, right? And then we're finally done with Link. I'd like to thank my founding patrons. Thank you to Katie Lee, Jamie Benson, Mina, Paul Taylor, Lori, and hello, Josephine. Thank you so much for being my very first patrons. If you're new here and you enjoyed watching this video, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Every sub, bell ringing, like, and share makes me do a little happy dance. Also, don't forget to leave a comment. I love chatting with you all afterwards. If you have the means, I would really love to see you over at my Patreon. Things are really starting to ramp up, and I can't wait to get to know you better. Oh, also, don't forget to go check out Logan Dolls on Instagram. Link wouldn't have happened if it weren't for him. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you had a sweet time.